Good evening, everybody. I'm David Suddjian, and welcome to Bird Bombs, Helpful Bursts of ID Info. Where's that on the bird? I'm joined tonight by Laura Stedman, who will be monitoring our chat and Q&A. So if you have any questions or comments as we go along, and we'll have some time at the end, fire away. And thanks to my Bird Bombs friends for this great crossbill card. I really appreciate it. It's a beautiful card, red crossbill, mountain finch. All right, so here it is, February, and it's definitely still winter here in the Denver area, right? February, we can sometimes consider as the ebb of our Colorado bird year. But even now, we have our waxwing fiesta to buoy our spirits. And, you know, spring is on the horizon. Bluebirds are some of our earliest migrants, and they're going to be coming in, moving north through the state, beginning by late February, a great sign of the times to come. So spring is near, and soon it really will be spring, and all our blues will be gone. But wait a minute, says the blue jay. I'm here and I'm blue. Now, have a look at this magnificent bird here on our screen. The blue jay is my favorite bird. And, you know, it has so much going on. It's a common bird here in the Front Range area, and we're blessed to be able to take it for granted. But here's the thing. Could you, right now, looking away from the screen and not peeking in your field guide, describe in any detail the various markings that are prominent on a blue jay? Have you ever looked in detail at those details? Well, tonight, that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take time to explore, identify, and to enjoy the details behind our bird identification. So we'll take a little more time with this Bird Bombs. We have a wide topic that strikes at the core of what we do. That's why you always find it right in the front of your field guides. So to reflect this big topic, I've selected images tonight of 147 different species to help us get there. It's a record for Bird Bombs. It's awesome. And all but one of them are on the Colorado list already. And the one that isn't is predicted to be showing up sometime soon, hopefully this year. So tonight we're talking about bird topography. So the names of parts and patterns and what's where and how things fold together. So we want to have a clear understanding of this so that we can benefit from what we see when we're out birding and from what we discuss with other birders and what we learn from our books and when we're online, and so that we can better communicate what we are seeing. But it goes even deeper than that, because to get there, you need to learn to see, to appreciate, to notice the details that form the whole bird. So you look more intentionally and you see more detail and you see more clearly. And sometimes we need to do that to identify birds, but in all circumstances, it always makes it a richer experience. So, you know, top birders seem to see a lot, right? And it seems like that's just because they're red hot birders. But really, they've taken time to come to understand this topic that we have tonight, and to learn how to see the details in the field. So if you are a newer birder and someone is talking and they're talking about you know, scapulars and superciliums or a subterminal band, it can be mystifying at times. And even if you've been at it for a while, we're still not sure what some of these things mean. And we look in different books and we get a lot of different terms, and some of them seem to contradict each other. So one of the first places that we encounter bird terms and jargons is in our field guide. This is an image from the Sibley guide, which I think is my favorite for kind of summarizing this stuff. And what I especially recommend is the images that he has along with these diagrams where he describes the posture of the birds and how that affects what you're seeing. and what's illustrated. But you know, as you go along, you open up different guides and you're looking in different resources and you're getting all of these different names. And then you start to look in specialized guides and it kind of focuses in on certain areas, and some maybe are a little more technical than others. And it kind of becomes a little bit overwhelming. I mean, how are you supposed to absorb all this stuff when you're just trying to figure it out? You're not an expert. How are you supposed to get there? I just think it's just too much. So tonight, let's just wait a minute and let's maybe take a step back. And we'll see the bird for the parts, all right? So sometimes it's really easy because dramatic parts and colors may dominate our impression, and ID is really easy, right? We all pretty much know a cardinal when we see it, at least in decent lighting, and it's hard to mistake that scissor-tail flycatcher when you see the tail. So we have birds like that. But then there's differences in among species that may be much more subtle, and the ID is nuanced. And then we have to consider careful things that we may not be so familiar with, that may not be so easy to observe, but primary projection, wing panel contrast, eye-ring details, you know, head shape, these kinds of things. And those are the sorts of things we need to delve into if we're going to hope to identify Impedinax flycatchers like we see most of our regular Colorado Impedinax arrayed here. And then as you start to look, you notice that there are certain patterns that recur on different birds as you're looking at them in the field guide and encountering them in the field. So feather tracks, different groupings of feathers on the bird create patterns. And we see those patterns repeated, and they're common even among species that aren't particularly related. As you can see here, we have some songbirds, a warbler and a sparrow and a vireo, and a flycatcher there, not a songbird, but a passerine. And then we get out woodpeckers, mallards, sandpiper, goshawk. They're all showing some common threads here, like this pale supercilium that we see over the top of the eye on all of these different species, or that sort of face pattern in general, and we'll be looking at that a lot more. Okay, so first thing let's consider is the basic thing that's covering our birds, and that's feathers. And we're not going to go into any detail, but I mostly want to point out that we have flight feathers, and they're on the wing, and they are strong. Flight feathers are relatively strongly made. They have to withstand a lot of wear and tear and a lot of forces, and so they're pretty strong. And they have a Latin name, plural, remiges or remix. And sometimes you'll see remiges, occasionally remix, but that is something to be aware of. But we don't encounter that too much. So flight feathers on the wing, and then we have tail feathers, and they're on the tail, and they're also strong and stiff. And more commonly, you might hear this scientific name, rectrices or rectrix. You'll encounter that pretty frequently. And flight feathers generally are narrower on the leading edge. You can see this on the Say's FEB. These darker little margins here are the leading edge ahead of the shaft, and they're narrower than the trailing part. But tail feathers tend to be more symmetrical than flight feathers. You can appreciate that, especially on this flicker here. The feathers are kind of evenly, even from left to right there. So they're very symmetrical. Look at those great stiff points, emphasizing the stiffness of those particular tail feathers, the woodpeckers. All right, so then we have other feathers that cover the body, and parts of the wing that are not the flight feathers, and parts of the tail that are not the tail. And these we call coverts, body feathers, contour feathers, different names for different things. And they tend to be smaller and shorter, and they're not so stiff. But so now let's take a closer look. So parts you need to know. It's not quite this simple, but this is how we're going to approach it. We're going to break it down into these 6 groups: bill, head, body, wings, legs and feet, and tail. All right, so everybody stay back. We got a bird bombs blast zone. Blammo. All right, so first let's start with the bill or the beak. I mean, which is it? Is this thing interchangeable? So let's delve into this a little bit. So the bill, we can see here, is defined here as the beak of a bird. Okay, well, that's helpful. And here's Colorado's billed birds. There are 19 of them. So pretty good cross section. If anybody has seen all 19 of these billed birds, then you've seen indeed some rarities along with some of our regulars. So it's a good challenge. So the bill is the beak of the bird, and the beak, it turns out, is a bill. So what the heck? We're not going to do much with that, right? So here's our beak birds. There's only 6. And it turns out the difference between a beak and a bill, well, there's not a thing. The words are synonymous. But ornithologists tend to say bill more often than beak. And this is the Denver Field Ornithologist show tonight. So we are going to go with billed in our terminology tonight. I want to make sure you check out this nice little joke here at the bottom of the screen. Pause there for a minute. So we're going to go with bill. And let's start out with these big-billed birds here. We've got some common ravens, and we've got, of course, a bald eagle. And hey, you want to know a foolproof method to distinguish ravens from crows every time? Come on one of my DFO field trips, and I'll tell all. I love to talk about that. First thing we can notice is these ravens in this fabulous image by Ron LaValle have these nice mustaches going out their bill. These are actually called rictal bristles. And there aren't too many times when rictal bristles come into play in bird ID. It does actually come into play with ravens. These are common ravens, and Chihuahuan ravens have a little different pattern. We're not going into that tonight, but there's also rictal bristles that are down around the base of the bill. You can see them a little bit over on this left-hand raven, just poking out a little bit there. Around that side of the bill, and those look more whiskery, and sometimes they're very prominent on some species and important in the way that they feed. All right, so upper mandible is the upper part of the bill, and the lower mandible is the lower part of the bill. So one term that you encounter about the upper part of the bill, about that upper mandible, is called the culmen, and it's this upper edge, this profile edge of the upper mandible is the culmen, and that can be important in bird ID in various groups of birds. So that's a good term to be familiar with. And then there's the nail on the bill, which seems kind of obvious. On these raptors and on these ravens, it's a pointy projection that sticks down and looks dangerous. It's a little different on ducks, as we'll see in a little bit. All right, so there's also something we call the gape, and that's the space where the two mandibles open up and are connected. They're at the craw, if you will, and you can see the gapes projecting back on the closed bill of this bald eagle, and a little less obvious here on these ravens, but with this guy with his mouth open, that's pretty big. So also on the bill, there's a nair, which is just the nostril, and it's usually a simple hole that's there somewhere, sometimes easy to see, sometimes not so easy. Here's something to learn. So the bill has cutting edges, and they are called tomia, the two of them together, or a tomium, a singular cutting edge of the mandible. And occasionally that does come into practice, and it's good to think about if you're going to get snapped by a goose or something. You're going to learn real fast what that tomium is all about. And so fancy long throat feathers are a highlight for this raven. I just want to point that out. We don't get to appreciate that too much. And notice the purple gloss on these guys. Aren't they beautiful? And isn't this interesting? So here's this big brain. You can always tell it's a raven by that as well. And watch out for the void. All right, so other features we can see on bills include something that's called a sear. So when you see a prominent paler area over the top of the base of the bill, over the base of that upper mandible, you can see the nair there as well. We call that the sear. And that's something that comes into play in raptor ID. Is it prominent or not? What color? Maybe how bright? Those kind of things. We can see the gape here on this lovely ferruginous hawk. We know that's a field mark for the ferruginous hawk, is the way this yellow gape comes back, and is very easy to see coming back all the way below the eye. All right, here's another sort of gaping situation here, the California gull. Appreciate that tongue. And we'll look at some other build details soon. Notice the gape here is colored differently. This California gull is in late winter. He's still got some winter color, but we can see color around the eye and on the bill that's telling us it's got some hormones flowing and it's getting some extra color going there. So another place we think about gapes, and this is really important, is with baby birds. So when you see baby birds begging and their mouth is wide open, their gapes are all pale colored here, and it helps to make a great target for the parents as they come in to feed the birds. And even after they fledge, they're still begging. You still see the gape, but you can recognize the juvenile birds. This isn't just for swallows, it's really for many birds, by the pale gape. So after they've left the nest and they start to look more like adult swallows or adult other birds, they still retain that pale gape. So here's another neat bill detail to consider. We all love the shrikes, and these are dangerous birds. Okay, look at this guy, and this is such a beautiful bird. But notice one detail on the upper mandible. So it's called a tomial tooth. I put this in tonight not so much as an ID feature, but just as something that's fun to be aware of, and maybe you'll see it one day if you get a great view or a nice picture like this one. The tomial tooth is a little projection that is along the rostral tomium of the Rhamphotheca. Okay, that's as technical as we're going to get tonight, but I just love that little technical explanation. But what it really means is you have this hard tooth-like projection that's coming down, and it's doing work for the shrike. It's helping it to kill its prey. And we also see that in falcons. So the merlin and the peregrine falcon and others have a tomial tooth. And, the shrike, this is probably how the shrike thinks. My tomial tooth penetrates quickly to the spinal cord between the reticulating vertebrae, damaging it and producing partial paralysis in my prey, thus rendering it easier to kill. Ugh. Love them. So shorebirds are a neat group to appreciate bills with, because they have a lot of different sizes and lengths and shapes, and that's one of the ID features we use. So we'll just look at a few shapes of bills featuring shorebirds. Recurved. Indeed, did you know that the family name for the avocets and the stilts is Recurvorostridae, which means basically curved nose or recurved nose, which is a curve that goes upwards. It curves back towards the bird's head and upwards. There's a decurved bill, like on the curlew, that curves down. And notice these curves are kind of pronounced. They're not iffy, right? And the whimbrel also has a pronounced decurved bill, but there's an upsweep as well. That's what I call it, at least for the marble godwit has an upswept bill. And we think of upswept maybe in the greater yellowlegs, or a fine bill that happens to be straight, or some others here, the drooped bill of the pectoral sandpiper or dunlin, and the sanderling with a more stout bill. And then you can kind of compare, a blunt versus a tapered tip of the bill. So those kinds of words are helpful for describing and understanding these shapes of these great shorebirds. And now let's take it to a great thing for this season, since we don't have many shorebirds around, but we do have a lot of gulls in some places. And one of the things you look at on gulls is their bills. You want to see what the bill shape is, what the colors are, and what the markings are. Very important for gull ID. And I've got here images of winter gulls, nearly all adults. Not quite all adults, but good enough for our purposes. And we can kind of compare some of these things about bill size, and we'll look at markings. We see most gulls have yellow bills, and they have some kind of marking out there. Some have very plain bills, like the short-billed gull with sort of no markings on this individual, but many of them have some black or some red on their bills. Now, I threw in this young glaucous wing gull because a lot of the ones that are found here in Colorado, it's a rarer gull, but a lot of them are first cycle birds that look more like that than the adult that I have here. Going all up to our biggest gulls. And the glaucous gull here is not an adult, that's a first cycle bird in there. But look at those bill details, and we can also appreciate a lot about the eyes and the markings on the head, but we won't focus on that. Let's just look at this one element here. The lower mandible has a little angle here, there's a little way in from the tip, and it's called a gonies, pronounced gonies, G-O-N-Y-S, and that angle, well, the gonies actually is this little segment of the bill from the tip to the angle, and then the gonidial angle is the angle. And a lot of times on gulls, there's a marking there, a color, black or red or both. And the red spot is called a gonidial spot. And it is pecked at by the baby gulls to make the parents regurgitate food. So it's providing a function, but it also is an ID feature for us. All right, so I added in here after the great black back, another gull here at the end. See if you can think who this might be. This looks like a big gull because I put it with the big gulls. This is wintertime, right? But it's got a clean head, bill not quite as hefty as the black-backed, and a little different there in the head shape. Yeah, that's a Western gull. All right, so be a rarity, especially now in the winter, but something to be thinking about. And let's watch for our first state record of black-tailed gull. Okay, it's one of the top ranked species that's predicted to turn up in the state. So here's a nail on the bill of this lesser scaup here. And that's another sort of a nail. But let's consider now some head features as we move along from the bill to the head. So a lot of this is kind of obvious, but it starts to get into the weeds as we go along. So take a look at the crown of this scaup. The crown is the top part of the head, and the forehead is the forehead in front there above the bill, and the nape is the back part. We can think of it like the back, lower back of the head, and the part of the neck here. And nape area is the nape area on this scaup. Here's another little feature that helps us identify it as a lesser scaup. Sorry, let me go back. It has this nice little unevenness. You can see individual feathers projecting out there. I call that a disturbance on the rear crown, which helps us separate it from the greater scaup, which is not so disturbed. But so there's a few other areas that don't stand out on this duck, but we can begin to encounter the names. Auriculars, or ear patch, ear area, auriculars, lore, the area in front of the eye, between the eye and the bill, and the cheek, auriculars. Sometimes they're kind of synonymous on smaller birds, but on bigger birds like ducks, they're kind of different areas. Let's take a look here, beautiful lazuli bunting. And there you can see the lore is kind of outlined, helping us here with this lazuli bunting. We can appreciate the area that is the lores, and we can see that even a little bit on this flicker, which has some brown colored lores. And we see some different things going on. Notice the bright red mark. So we're going to learn that as a malar stripe or malar line. And it's coming down from the lower mandible, down across the area below the cheek. And notice this separate patch that's identified out here by being raised up a little bit. These are actually the auriculars on this bird. And sometimes you can see feather tracks by how the birds manipulate their feathers, as you can there in that moment. So we have now lore, malar stripe or malar line, and auricular patch or auriculars. And let's kind of go forward now. And we're going to start putting the pieces together here a little bit more and add some pieces to the puzzle. So first we've got to ask, which kind of sparrow is this? Can you tell? Nice and streaky, good head pattern. Well, no, not a sparrow at all, but a female red-winged blackbird, which some can easily mistake for a sparrow by general markings, but we can see a lot of other details, especially the bill shape is helpful. We won't worry about the ID anymore, but let's, bird blast review. Let's take a look here. So where's the culmen? That's right, along the upper edge of the bill. And where are the tomia, plural for tomium? Right there along the cutting edge. And how about the gape of the bill? On this blackbird, it's way back there, below the lores, right? And so we did just learn these terms. And I'm going to toss in here, these are sort of obvious. The chin is the area right below the bill, and the throat is the larger area down below. No hard and fast definitions there, but we do see some lines and markings on the face that are giving us some hard and fast borders for some of this. In this case, the auriculars are kind of pale and bordered by darker, and we'll learn a little bit more about that. We see a pale malar. Notice the pretty color on the face of this female redwing. Subtle little thing. As you start to talk about the patterns on birds, you encounter a number of different words that can be applied in different ways. And on birds' heads, we see stripes and lines, and often it's really interchangeable. It doesn't matter which it is you use. When you see median, it means something down the middle, right? So my median stripe would be right down the middle of my head, but I don't have one. Lateral means along the side of it. And super or supra means above something, right? And post is behind, and sub is under, submarine, under the water. And a border refers to edges and margins of things. Okay, so we have all these different terms, and we can kind of put things together just from that a little bit. So let's add a little bit here now. We're going to add the supercilium, or the eyebrows, the pale line above the eye, super, above, right? There is an area here called the supraloral area, which is just the area of the supercilium, if you will, that's above the lore. We can understand what that means just thinking about the words. Here's an eye line, which on this blackbird and usually is dark, going from, in this case, pretty much just behind the eye, kind of broad. And the supercilium is flanked above, in this case, by a lateral crown stripe. And so that's a dark line that's above the pale supercilium. And we've got other kinds of borders, mustachial stripe. So notice the malar is often a pale line here on the bill coming down from the lower mandible, the malar stripe, malar line, and it's bordered often by dark. And that dark here we call the mustachial stripe. We can think mustache, and here it has a fancy boring name, lateral throat stripe, or we can think of it like a whisker, if you will. And sometimes those lines are there and sometimes they're not, but those are their names. And here's a great example of lores for us, if you will. These are two great Colorado birds, the Gambel's white-crowned sparrow on the left and the mountain white-crowned sparrow on the right. And one of the big differences between these two birds, aside from the fact that they occur at some different times of the year, is that they have different colors on their lores. So the Gambel's have a pale lore, and the mountain white-crowned sparrow has these beautiful black lores. So when you're up above timberline or near timberline in the summertime, that's the one you're finding. And out around wintertime now, by and large, we have light-lored birds, or very few are dark birds in Colorado. All right, so neat thing about sparrows, prairie sparrows especially, is they kind of have it all when it comes to markings. All right, so we've just presented a number of different markings on the head, and we're going to add one more or so here. And we've got a little listing over here on the right-hand side so we can refer to, and we'll notice that there's some patternings going on here. I'll just start. These are oriented from like the middle of the crown down the side of the head. So it starts out usually pale, then dark, then pale, then dark, then some kind of color in between, then light or dark, then dark, then pale, then dark. So things alternate, creating these strong patterns, like on this lark sparrow, which pretty much has everything that we need to consider among the markings on the face. So we've got here a median crown stripe and a lateral crown stripe. We have adding that median crown stripe to our mix. In this case, we see the bird has a different sort of marking below the eye. It's like a broad crescent, but there's a dark eye line going through the eye. Here's the auricular patches red, a white malar line bordered by a black mustachial stripe, and a dark lateral throat stripe. Notice how it kind of flares out there. And notice how this malar line kind of wraps around the bottom of the auricular patch. That can be an important feature in sparrow ID. So there are some of those features identified there. And we'll add some other prairie sparrows and see how it plays out. So the clay-colored sparrow is another one that's strongly patterned, not as dramatic as that lark sparrow, but it has everything going on as well. And we can see all those different features. Good to point out here that sometimes there's contrast in colors that can be useful. We see this gray nape contrasting with a brown auricular patch. It's brown, it's not gray. Notice how white the malar line is. And we have sort of a tan colored supercilium. It's not white. So those color details can be important to notice. And now we'll ratchet down the patterning a little bit. Still a lot going on in this Vesper sparrow. Notice this, what's prominent when you look at this bird? What I see is a prominent complete white eye ring. We haven't got there yet, but we know that one. And this white malar wrapping around the bottom of this kind of complicated looking auricular patch. And so those are two important ID features for a Vesper sparrow. And the grasshopper sparrow, getting a little plainer yet, not so much going on the lower part of this bird's head, but we see some prominent patterning above and a nice eye ring. Look at this field sparrow. It's stripping away some grass seeds. It puts up its head there. We can see a little better. It's getting plainer even still, right? We've still got this eye ring, but look, you can still see some of those details we were talking about, even though it's not so strongly marked. You can see a faint eye line coming back, and it kind of broadens out. You can tell where the auricular patch is. So this kind of forms a border around the top and rear part of the auricular patch. There's a hint of a lateral throat line and a little bit darker on the crown, but very plain on the field sparrow. And then the Cassin sparrow is plainer yet. And this is a bird, sometimes you see it and you say there really aren't any field marks. This excellent picture, we can see there is a little bit of detail, but they're very plain. Now, not so plain is the lark bunting, big sparrow, and it can be pretty confusing when you encounter these guys after the nesting season, juvenile lark buntings and females in general that can look a lot like other kinds of sparrows, but they're bigger and they look a little off. And if you're not used to seeing them, there's a lot going on there that we're maybe not ready for, big white patches on the wing, but they've also got some complicated stuff going on in the head. And whenever you're out looking at prairie sparrows, you're going to encounter the honorary prairie sparrow, which is not a sparrow, the western meadowlark. And you can see some of those same patterns, a prominent supercilium, some color at the lores. And when you start to look at meadowlarks and you get interested in identification of rarer ones, you're going to be looking at the malar, which is right there, and be appreciating the nature of the yellow or not yellow or how extensive that is there on the malar. So a little more detail on the eyes. The area that's around the dark pupil is called the iris. The color of it can be important. There is an eye ring that may be present, which could be feathering around the eye that is actually feathering. And then there's also an orbital ring, which is skin. On gulls, that can be important in some other birds, not so much on thrashers, but on gulls, the orbital skin color can be important. And during the breeding season, like in this case of this California gull, the orbital skin color is distinctive and much brighter. All right, so here's some different patterns we see on around eyes. You have eye rings that are complete eye rings. You have broken eye rings that can be somewhat complex, like the robin. Have you ever looked closely at the robin's head and appreciated what's going on there? Look at that, there's a lot going on. And then we have spectacles, which like on a vireo, as one of the species where we see spectacles. And spectacles just means it kind of looks like they're wearing glasses, right? So it has a line connecting across the lores above a little dark eye line there that's before the eye, and connecting above the lores and wrapping around in this generally sort of complete looking eye ring. And sometimes the eye ring is broken or drawn back, and those are important features to be aware of and to be describing. Or there might be crescents. The eye is divided into arcs or crescents above and below, or maybe just below. And sometimes you can see how those arcs are split by a subtle little eye line, or maybe not so subtle, like on this young chipping sparrow here. All right, so other things going on in the head, of course, very dramatic. Nobody is confused about the idea of these hooded mergansers with this big crest or fan. And there's other kinds of crests as well, such as the Steller's jay has a crest. It's like a jaunty crest, right? But take a look at the Steller's jay here. Anything catch your eye? Anything different from what you normally see if you're up in the mountains here in Colorado? So one thing is the face is actually different. The head patterning is different. So this is a Pacific coastal form of the Steller's jay, California, but not here. Here we have the interior form, and they has these fancy white markings along the area here above the lores going onto the crest and above the eye and right below the eye, and some a little more white on the chin area there. So a little different there on our blue jay, but those facial details head details are different. Notice the face pattern on this Cassin's finch. It's one of the ways you tell a Cassin's finch when you glance at it, female or a male like this. They have a face pattern. There's a pale supercilium, a dark auricular patch, and a pale malar. I noticed on field trips lately, people, when we see Cassin's finch, they say, oh, I recognize it because it has a dark face. Well, what they're seeing is that dark auricular patch. All right. So now here we are in winter, and none of these birds are here yet at all, unless you can find a rare wintering yellow rump somewhere. I think pretty much all these are gone or have died if they were lingering around earlier in the winter. And so let's dream about a little bit with vireos and warblers. You know, when I started birding, these two families, the vireo family and the wood warbler family, were side by side in the field guides. You go vireos to warbler, it was really convenient. And but now you crack open the guide and they're separated by quite a number of families there in the pasturines. And indeed, they have one important difference is that the vireos have 10 primaries and the warblers just 9. But there's some other differences, of course, as well. And you can see as you look at these face patterns we see on the vireos in the left-hand group, we see some common threads. We see spectacle, eyeline, and supercilium turning up in one way or another in pretty much all these birds. And some of the details that are important to consider could be the coloration of those features or how prominent they are. Notice, let's see, for example, also how different parts of those features may contrast with the head, or how the head's contrasting with other parts of the birds. You know, if you're looking at these red-eyed vireo, one that's similar is the yellow-green vireo, only recorded once in Colorado so far, but hey, it could turn up again. And notice they have the same sort of face pattern, and they actually both have reddish eyes. This one, a young one here, the yellow-green, so a little duller. But the face pattern is similar, but one is much more prominently marked than the other one. So those kind of considerations are important. In the warblers, we see a lot more variety, both colors and patterns, some from having almost no head patterns like the American redstart to others having very pronounced head patterns. If you look at this Townsend's warbler on the bottom left of the warbler group and the black-throated gray to the right of it, these are two closely related warblers, and you can see they have a lot of common threads in how they're marked. But you can notice there are some differences. The black-throated gray has a yellow laurel spot lacking in the Townsend's, which the lores are dark, and has this crescent under the eye in the Townsend's warbler. Notice how the yellow wraps around the auricular patch. That's an important detail sometimes in warblers. It's not wrapping around the auricular patch in this yellow rump here, for example. So lots of fun things to look at on the faces of our warblers. So now we're going to switch off the head here. We're going to move down the bird a bit into the body, and we're going to look above and below. And let's start with these beautiful images of sharp-tailed grouse. All right, and as we look above, we're going to consider some things there and some different words for things below. And some of these are words you're very familiar with, but you may not be thinking about exactly where they are. So notice I've identified here, well, let me just go through that for a bit before we go further on my side thought. Here we've got the upper side of the bird. I'm just tossing some general areas out here. Hind neck seems obvious. The back is the upper part of this main upper part area. We call generally the back, okay? And the rump is the lower region of that. And it's different from the upper tail covert. So here's the tail coming down, and it's hidden by some feathers here that we call upper tail coverts. Those are lying over the tail feathers. So they're different from the rump, and sometimes they're differently marked. And in this case, not so easy to tell. And on the sides of the bird, when its wings are closed, we have a feather region here called the scapulars. We'll learn more about that. So let's check out the bottom side here. We know about these things around the head already. We'll add the foreneck. And then generally the breast is the middle part of this upper area here. And along the sides of the breast are the sides. Then you have the belly below the breast, generally down towards the legs, and along the flank of the belly are the flanks. So the sides go with the breast and the flanks go with the belly. And those sometimes are important areas to be looking at that can be differently marked or colored. So you notice, let's see here. So we've got a little differentiate. I noticed it was a Colombian form of the sharp-tailed grouse I called out. And I got to take a little S&D moment here because this is really cool. Colorado has 2 subspecies of sharp-tailed grouse. Did you know that? They live in different parts of the state, and never the 2 shall meet. So one of them is called the Colombian sharp-tailed grouse, and it's the one that is in these pictures that were taken at Steamboat Springs, and it reaches into Colorado, just like mostly Moffat County and Routt County in that area, formerly down south here, but not anymore. And it is associated with birds in this area up in through here into British Columbia. There's different subspecies that occur in the prairie regions, and there's one southern prairie subspecies, Jamesy, that we have here in Colorado, just in the northeast part of the state, mostly Weld County and Logan County now, maybe rarely elsewhere. It used to occur all the way down to Douglas County, but that was some time ago, and they've been extirpated from that area. So enough S&D, but that's really important and kind of cool. Couldn't pass it up. So let's look a little more detail here at some of the upper parts terms that we're going to learn. So we have a beautiful American tree sparrow. You can see some of the details we saw on the head before. We have this nice broad gray supercilium, There's an eye line that's just barely behind the eye, post-ocular. Notice it kind of flares out here and helps to define this auricular patch. A little bit of a mustachial, and really no contrast with the malar there, lateral crown stripe. And on this bird, we can see the back is showing up pretty well because it's got some different colored and patterned feathers there that are helping to distinguish the back from this tan rump on this chipping sparrow. And down below, we can see the upper tail coverts. All right, so along the side of these areas, so the nape, back, rump, upper tail coverts, we see there's some the scapulars draping down over the sides of the wing of this perched American tree sparrow. So the scapulars are kind of hiding part of the wing, and that's very common in a lot of birds when the wing is closed, and sometimes that can be kind of extreme. So here's the parts of the wing that are alongside these upper parts, and we'll learn more about these, but we have some secondary coverts and some tertials there that are bordering these upper part areas. So scapulars along the shoulders of the birds, and we can even see them a little bit distinguished in this nice image of the male northern harrier. There's the scapulars on either side of the bird's wing and back area. And the white that we see on this harrier is really on its upper tail coverts, okay, trending a little bit into this rump area, but we could call that upper tail coverts. And let's take a look at the scapulars on this gadwall. Now, one of the most beautiful things to do is check out our ducks in more detail with the information that we're talking about tonight, because you're really going to come to appreciate some fantastic patterns. So the S here is showing us these long, kind of fancy looking patterned feathers or fancy modified feathers that are the scapulars, the shoulder, and then here is tertials. So we can look back at the sparrow and we see scapulars up on the shoulder, and the tertials are actually wing feathers, not body feathers, and they're here following behind the scapulars. But what I want you to see is the beautiful modified scapulars, how lovely they are and how subtle it befits this beautiful gadwall with its subtle coloration compared to some ducks, but very fancy. And we can see that even played out here on this American widgeon. It's coming in for a landing here, and it has a scapulars are not so fancy as on the gadwall, but they're differentiated from these fancier tertials. Notice these long feathers here with the dark feathers with pale margins. Those are tertials, equivalent to the bird here on the equivalent to the sparrow. These three feathers coming down, and they're making a fancy pattern on the widgeon. We can see how that plays together now. The bird has landed on the snow, and there's the scapulars ahead of the fancy tertials. So look for that when you're looking at ducks. Now let's go back a sec. Notice these big white wing patches here that are on the secondary coverts. We won't worry about that. But when the bird lands, most of that is covered up. In this case, you can see a patch of that. It could arrange its feathers differently, so you could see less or a little more. Here we have the male and the female. Here's the male's modified scapulars and these pretty tertials. The female has modified scapulars too, but they're different, and her tertials aren't as brightly marked. So kind of cool to appreciate that on our ducks. So continuing our tour of the upper part, sometimes when the bird lands and its wings are closed, it all kind of looks the same, like on this greater yellowlegs with this kind of spangled patterning above, but it's hard to differentiate much of anything. If you look closely, you can see some things going on. And sometimes it's important to look closely and differentiate different feather tracks. It can be important. One thing we can notice on this least sandpiper, just thinking about the upper parts, here's our back. We can also call that area a mantle. In a shorebird, we would kind of generally refer to this area as a mantle, but you have the back, and then here's the scapulars, which is kind of a largish area on the closed wing of the sandpiper. The rest of the wing, most of the rest of the wing is hidden underneath these feathers here. And one of the neat patterns on a least sandpiper is that you have these white dots that are formed by the tips of these scapular feathers. And that shows up at quite a distance and even in less good images. Here's the long tertials sticking out on this least sandpiper, and we won't go any further into that on there. Western sandpiper, the scapular row here is a little bit reddish, and that's an ID feature. So you can look to see where are the scapulars. They're along the shoulders, on the upper edge of where that folded wing would be, but they're actually covering over much of the wing. Another place we encounter scapulars is when we see bootios and we're looking at their back and we're trying to decide sometimes, is there a pale V there, a backpack V, like we call it on the red-tailed hawk? Those are the scapulars that are forming that patterning. And we can see that as the bird flies off. Separate little tract here, the shoulder area in between the wing and the back. And they show up really well on this young Western gull. This is a brand new Western gull, not quite likely to see a brand new one like this in Colorado. It'd be a little more worn maybe, but we certainly could get first cycle birds. And look at these scapulars here in the back. Because this bird's hunched down and begging, it's got its back area kind of elevated, so you can really appreciate what's going on there. And the beautiful scapular area and covering over some part of the wing. In the case of the gull, you can see more of the wing, and we'll learn more about what we've got here, right? So we've got scapulars, we've got coverts that are covering over flight feathers, in this case secondaries, and some primaries, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at least, or is it 6, sticking out there at the tip of the wing. We'll get more into that. Mantle on a gull can generally be referred sort of, when we say it has a gray mantle, we're talking about this whole thing. More specifically, we can talk about this back scapular area, but like on gulls, when we say mantle, we're talking about this whole color area. But you know, on a younger gull, Western gull, this would be brown. And so the mantle, the scapulars and gray back would be more distinctively patterned. All right, so let's look a little more detail here at some underpart things. And let me tell you, the underparts of this dusky grouse were really soft. They were not stiff like the wings that were starting to beat me as I just let him go from my gentle grasp. But you can appreciate his belly here where my hand is, and the breast above that, and the undertail coverts below that. And we weren't supposed to be seeing these waxwings yet, but we'll enjoy them now while they're still there. So let's kind of look a little more detail at this underparts here, applying some of the same names. We've got this beautiful Cassin's kingbird, and we can see the breast in the middle, upper middle area, the belly, lower middle area, and the undertail coverts over the top of the tail feathers, over the base of the tail feathers, sides and flanks. We know all that. Watch out for that bug. And the brown cap rosy finch, we can appreciate those same areas, and it's helping us a little bit with some different coloration. We could say the belly of this brown cap rosy finch was pink going all the way up toward the breast. The sides were brown, but the flanks were pink. So we're going to use some of those words. All right, and on this Harris's sparrow, lovely picture by Diane Roberts. I love how it's standing on its tippy toes, reaching up for a grass seed maybe. And notice how the coloration and patterning on the sides is actually different from the coloration and patterning on the flanks, both in the markings and the base color a little bit. So kind of cool. Undertail coverts are sometimes important for ID, like on a Cassin's finch. And let's appreciate these nice reddish undertail coverts on these Bohemian waxwings, some of the jewels of our current winter crop. And look at this chipping sparrow. He's really relaxed. And notice how his breast feathers are fanning out over the sides of the wings. So in that case, you can see those feathers are going to be covering over parts of the wing. And we can even see that on the Harris's sparrow. If you go back, the feathers from his sides are covering over parts of the wing coverts and hiding them. All right, so lots of different markings on underparts, and some of these same sort of markings we can encounter elsewhere. We have bars and streaks. So bars go across side to side, and streaks are up and down. We can appreciate that adult Coopers and sharp-shinned hawks have bars, reddish bars, especially Cooper's hawk Sharpie. They kind of blend it, but the young accipiters have streaks underneath going up and down. But what to do about these two owls down here, huh? So we've got spotted owl on the right and the barred owl on the left. Now the barred owl looks to me like it's got streaks. So what the heck? And the spotted owl, I see some spots there, but it's definitely got bars and maybe streaks too. So they're kind of all messed up, but you can appreciate those beautiful birds, and some other species with some other markings. A chevron is kind of a triangular mark that you encounter mostly on the breast, or a spot or some kind of a bar on the back. Notice the fringes on the underparts of this northern shrike help to mark it, the brown coloration as well as an immature bird, but there's a distinctive pattern there. And the song sparrow on the right has streaking underneath, and it has a central spot on the breast, right? So sometimes there's an aggregation of streaks that forms a spot, or it may actually be a spot. You can see it's actually streaks on the song sparrow. What about this guy in the water here? Look at the bars on the undertail coverts and bars coming up the sides. Well, that's a different looking bird. Well, that's a long-tailed Jaeger. That's a juvenile long-tailed Jaeger, but fun to look at that. All right, so we're going to wing it now. We're going to switch to the wings. We've talked a little bit about a few details. Take a look at this beautiful picture by Gary Witt. A lot of times we take our most common birds for granted, but these are the ones that can teach us a lot because we can see them a lot and we can sometimes see them very well. So appreciate some things about the wings of this robin. We see that, remember, the flight feathers are this area here, and we'll have some different groups. And then we have feathers that cover over them, and those are the coverts. All right, so let's see how these feathers stack up. So in flight feathers, there are primaries, and they are the ones that are on the outer part of the wing. They're the longest feathers, the stiffest feathers, and sometimes they have distinctive shapes. There's usually either 9 or 10. Sometimes one is modified to be very short or reduced, and we don't even really see it. But there's the primaries coming in, and the secondaries are then an inner tract that are also fairly big part of the wing. And then way on the inside are the tertials. So here's those things, primaries in pink. We'll keep these colors, secondaries in green, and the tertials less evident and smaller. And the tertials on songbirds are really just the inner 3 secondaries. There's 3 tertials, and that's what they are. But we call them differently, and sometimes they're important to be aware of in different ways. And let's look at one little detail that we often don't pay attention to in the field, but we can appreciate in this great shot and in scope views as well. And that's the alula. Sometimes it's called the alula, but I'm going to go with alula because that's what Peter Pyle calls it, and I think he's great. So it's a small patch at the bend of the wing. It's 3 feathers, and here's the alula here, 1, 2, 3. Okay, and it actually has a function somewhere on the slide. I don't know what my next thing is. We'll learn more about that. But the alula is helping the bird at times when it needs extra lift. Sometimes you don't notice it at all, but sometimes it's standing out quite visibly. So we've got the primaries, secondaries, and tertials, but notice we have some coverts that go over them. Here's the primaries, and over the primaries are primary coverts. And sometimes you can appreciate other levels of primary coverts, like these little marginal ones here. But we're mostly looking at just this larger batch over the base of the primaries, protecting them and providing more aerodynamics. And then we have the secondaries, and they're covered by secondary coverts, right? And there are several tracks of coverts. So the primary coverts, they're marked. And among the secondary coverts, we can see there's some bigger ones, and then going further up, some medium ones, and then some little ones that are less distinct. And these have names, and lesser secondary coverts, not distinct, the median secondary coverts in the middle, and the greater secondary coverts. So let's not get too confused by these things. Remember, coverts are covering over the flight feathers that they're associated with. That's an important point. Now we can see all this right here on this meadowlark and more. Isn't this a fabulous bird? You can even see the alula hard at work over here as this bird is maybe coming in for a landing and needing a little more lift. 1, 2, 3 feathers there. And let's look, what did we learn before about the back and the scapulars and some face pattern, but let's not worry about that. Let's take a look here at our flight feathers, primaries. Notice there's a pattern shift when we get to the secondaries. That's not uncommon. And the tertials here are a little longer and a little different in their way from the secondaries. And here in this, I want to go back because this one, again, we'll look at these coverts, a greater primary covert, greater secondary coverts, median secondary coverts, and lesser secondary coverts. So they're just stacked up, and there's those primary coverts over the primaries. On this flicker, you can appreciate the modified shape of some of these outer primaries, very pointy and narrow, and then coming on the inner ones, much broader. Barred sandpiper, can you visualize where the primaries are? How about the primary coverts? So you can even see a smaller tract above these main primary coverts. We won't worry about differentiating that. And as you're looking, can you remember where the scapulars are? They're a little bit distinct. Here they are right here. Okay. And the upper tail coverts are these feathers coming over the base of the tail feathers. So they're covering over those tail feathers, just like the wing coverts are covering over the primaries. All right, white pelican, you know, sometimes there's distinctive colorations in a big way out on the wing, and we don't worry too much about the details. So we can see these white lines here, actually the shafts of the feathers, big shafts, and showing up contrasting, and a number of primaries going in, and then secondaries, and the black is getting narrower as you go out. You can see the primary coverts here, and this being a very big wing, we can see some other lesser primary covert tracks up there. Notice that this bird has black flight feathers, or mostly so. And that's commonly, you'll see that birds that travel a long way, birds that live in harsh environments, that get a lot of sun glare and abrasion from different things, they often will have dark colored flight feathers, especially primaries, darker black, but or at least darker. And that's because those dark feathers are more resistant to wear than pale feathers. Structurally, so they last longer. It's really important for birds to have long-lasting flight feathers, right? All right, so we're really winging it now here. Let's apply some of what we just saw and also appreciate something new. So primaries, secondaries, tertials kind of disappearing in this view. We have the underwing part of the bird. We don't really differentiate usually the different covert tracks, but they're there. We often on a small bird will just call this the underwing lining. All right, now on a bigger bird, you can differentiate things more visually, but even so, the underwing coverts are here. And if we say underwing lining, we're kind of talking generally about it, but there's other parts of the underwing too. We can distinguish the axillaries, which are the wing pit. And so on the prairie falcon, it's this dark, it's darkly colored and contrasty. These are the axillaries, and part of them are dark. And so we look for that dark wing pit with some other dark along these underwing coverts here. And we don't see that when we see a peregrine falcon. We see that it has a more even color there, or not a contrasting dark armpit or axillaries. Here's a nice underwing linings on the gadwall here. You can see the underwing coverts, but we just can generally worry about underwing linings. And look at, there's actually some beautiful detail in the primaries with pale areas and dark tips that we often don't appreciate. And on the upper wing, it's beautiful brown patch on the, what part of the wing is that? So let's see, we see two interesting things going on in the wing of this gadwall that we need to know about. One is there's a patch right here on these feathers. So we know these are the primaries, so these are the secondaries. And the inner part of the patch on dabbling ducks has a distinctly colored and patterned area called a speculum. On a gadwall, it's white. And above the primaries, secondaries, are secondary coverts and more secondary coverts. And these have this nice, beautiful, warm brown patch. So that's where that is on that gadwall. Now, we don't get to sometimes, if you look carefully, you can appreciate the shape on swift wings, but usually photos you have to take to really get a good impression. But one of the things that's kind of cool is it's subtle details. Look at the very, very long primaries on this chimney swift on the left compared to the very, very short secondaries coming in on the inner part of the wing that kind of just disappear. And he's got kind of a secondary bulge here, is what you could call that. And it's an interesting mark because the Vox's swift, which is a rarity in Colorado, the line that goes across more smoothly, more straight, doesn't really bulge out there. So those kind of details sometimes we need to appreciate. Now, this slide is for Vicki. And we were just talking about hawks in flight and winter hawks and so on. And when you get into raptors, they have their whole set of terms that sometimes we don't encounter otherwheres among birds. And I'm not exhaustive here by any means, but these are some of the things we need to know. So I've got our 3 winter bootios here all teed up across the bottom. Wouldn't it be fantastic to have all 3 going? We sort of had this in a way on our DFL field trip last Sunday, led by Joey Kellner out in the Northeast. We had great views of all these different hawks. And as you look at them, we can see some of these different features that we're going to need to know. One thing is that's all we always talk about on the red-tailed hawk is the patagials. Those are these feathers along the leading edge of the underwing between the body and head area and this area that we call the wrist. So the patagials. And on the red tail, unless it's a pretty dark bird, they always are distinctively dark and separately marked. You can see on the ferruginous hawk here in the middle, it's got patagial too, but they're not as distinct a patch. And sometimes they don't show up as dark as even that. The patagials on this rough-leg hawk are pale, right? So different. So then we also see a comma, and that's kind of like it says a little curved mark, like a punctuation mark out there on the outer part of the wing, just beyond the bend of the wing that we call the wrist. So the wrist itself is referring to bones in the wing, but they're really not the wrist. They're equivalent to your knuckle. All right, but we use this term. But in general, when we're talking about it in bird ID, we're talking about the bend of the wing is the wrist. And so the comma is outward of that. And going out further, we see that on these bootios, that there are distinct feathers. You can see these long primaries, usually 6 or so, 5 or 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, that we call fingers because they stand out and they form the hand. Now, we see some other things about these hawks that I can't go into, but you can appreciate differences around the belly patterning and the tail coloration and patterning, even the leggings on these on the ferruginous adult and the leggings on this rough-leg hawk. Now, talking about hands and fingers, the golden eagle and all eagles have really big hands with more fingers showing, usually 6. If the feathers are all there, they molt, and sometimes they're not there. Notice there's some other patterns going on. We see these white patches, and if you look closely, where are they? They're at the base, mostly at the base of the secondaries and inner primaries. So outer secondaries, inner primaries, if not all primaries. Let's see, yeah. And so the outer part of the wing is actually on those flight feathers. And when you see a bald eagle, it's different because the white is distributed mostly on the underwing coverts or the wing linings, and a little bit on the secondaries themselves. So the patch is not, that's prominent, is not way out there like on the golden eagle. So different areas of the wing, different feather tracks, creating those patterns. So this is one of the really important things to kind of get a grasp on. And you can appreciate this when you look at birds close up or in nice photos here. And that is what happens when the wing closes. So some of the feathers become hidden. So when you're trying to identify shorebirds or flycatchers or some other things, and you're looking at the closed wing, you need to know what you're looking at and what you can't see. So notice on the upper open wing of this housefinch on the left, that it is, you can see all those feather tracks, right? So primaries, secondaries, tertials, I think I have them labeled there. And notice on this blue grosbeak, the blue is up on those lesser primary coverts. The wing is closing a little bit. Some of the primaries are starting to fold under the secondaries, which are going to fold under those tertials. Here's a differentiation between those tracks. So here we see the primaries starting to close a little bit, and we can still see prominently these primary coverts and these wing bars on the secondary coverts. And we see that here now as we move down to the house finch on the lower right. The wing is almost all the way closed, not quite. And we can see that the primaries now are mostly hidden away, but we're still seeing some here because the wing's not all the way closed. Here's the secondaries and the tertials. All right. We'll come back to that thought. So let's take a little further with this ruby crown kinglet. Yeah, he's blowing his top. We don't get to see that all the time, but it's very dramatic. And notice this bird has these nice pale edgings on the feathers to help us distinguish what's going on. One thing that always strikes me when I look at kinglets is how their scapulars are overlaying the wing panel. So the wing panel is generally the side of the closed wing, right? This whole area here, and they're covering over. And so it hides most of, or sometimes all of, this upper wing bar on the fringes of the of the median secondary coverts, but you see prominently this lower wing bar. And let's see what flight feathers we can see here. So here's the primaries, and see the primary coverts. Here's the secondaries and secondary coverts where the wing bar is. And then tertials are bigger and differently outlined with white, 1, 2, and the third one hidden up there. Tertials, secondaries, laying over the top of the closed primaries, which aren't very long on this kinglet. Okay, now from the side a bit more, here's those primary coverts over the primaries sticking out. Here's secondary coverts over these secondaries that are over the top of the primary. So the outer feathers fold under the inner feathers. And then this is a different bird, but this guy, you can see his breast feathers kind of fluffed out, covering over the sides of his wing, in addition to the scapulars fluffing over the top. And the crown's getting hidden away. All right, so we're getting down to the bottom of the bird, or the end of the bird, however you're going to look at it. And take a look here. This is exactly why you don't want to be a fish, or at least not one where an osprey is going to be around. So we're going to introduce some different terms here. We start to talk about legs and feet collectively. So let's notice that some of the words we use to describe parts of the legs and feet are not actually the names of those parts, but they're what we call. So when we are looking at birds, sometimes we're talking about knees, but they're really ankles. But let's put a few things up here. So we've got a tarsus is the part of the bird's leg that's below the thing that we commonly call a knee, and we'll appreciate that more in a second. Of course, talons, or also called claws. Always think of talons in a bird like this. The birds have feathering along their legs. If it extends down onto the tarsus, especially, we call that leggings. And tibial feathering is up above the tarsus. So let's see. So here's the tarsus. And this is not a knee, but it's the metatarsal joint on these long-legged sandhill cranes. And so this is equivalent actually to our ankle, right? And this would be sort of, you can think of it as like the main part of our foot. And down here, the actual phalanges. So this is, we can think of it like the ankle, but the metatarsal joint. And we can't see a knee on the bird. Okay, it's up there out of view. And blackneck still takes all that to an extreme. But it kind of makes sense when you think, okay, if it's a knee, how come it's bending backwards? Well, it's not a knee, it's the ankle. It makes a little more sense when you look in this picture. Look at that size difference with that little baby stilt, but that baby stilt still has big legs. Songbirds, passerines, we call perching birds, and so their feet are made for perching, and they have strong muscles that lock and can grab on and hold them in place. Generally, they're very dainty. We could call these claws. Notice on the long spur, I included this Lapland long spur so we could appreciate the long claws. So those are the spurs, if you will, on a long spur. Nice leggings on a sharp-tailed grouse. And you ever seen the semi-palmations on a semi-palmated sandpiper? Well, good luck. It's not easy. If you do, it's hardly worth it. Here they are on this semi-palmated sandpiper image. The little bit of webbing at the base of the toes is a semi-palmations. That's what that means. Good luck. Maybe you'll find it on a semi-palmated plover, a little easier. And let's give a nod to the bird that don't have feet, but they do, of course. So the Apodidae, it means without feet. Swifts and hummingbirds are in the order Apodiformes. And actually the swifts are the Apodidae, the hummingbirds, different family, but in that same order. And hummingbirds can grab onto things in the way that a lot of perching birds do, but swifts have to cling. They don't grab onto twigs and things like other perching birds. Look at these long, long primaries coming down on these chimney swift wings, way out there. All right, as the tail folds. So again, on tails, we're concerned with various markings, some names we've already learned. We'll learn a few new ones. And one thing that we commonly see on tails is that the outer feathers are a little different, or the tips are a little different, and tails have different shapes. So we have, of course, long tails like on the Roadrunner, but sometimes there's nearly no tail at all. And a little fluff coming out here on this piebald grebe. But one of the distinctive features about the grebe family is they basically have such a minuscule tail. It's like there's no tail at all. And in fact, the family is the Podocipedidae. And if you translate that, it translates into ass foot, foot coming out of the butt. All right, so our great pied-billed grebe is Podoceps, ass foot, Podolimbus. All right, and so let's notice on the tail that when it's open, you can see all the feathers, or if it's partially open, but we'll become aware that if it's closed, we don't see all the feathers anymore. They're covered. And so as the tail closes, it's just those center feathers. Here's the center ones on this Cooper's hawk and center on this collared dove. Those are the ones that lie across the top, and the outer feathers fold under the tail. So this Cooper's hawk here, his tail's closed. We can see one complete feather and a good part of another one of those central feathers, but really almost nothing of the other feathers. However, if we look at the underside of the tail, we can see different pattern. Here we're looking at the outer feathers, and we can't see anything of the central feathers except their very tips, because on the underside of the tail of this Cooper's hawk, we can actually see the different feather tips because some of the feathers are shorter. It's an important feature in ID, and it's something that's important to consider when you're looking at tail feathers. On this blue jay, isn't it beautiful? It has, you can see just two central feathers overlaying the top of the tail. Can't tell what else is going on in the tail, but actually it's kind of complicated. It's got this beautiful white tips and much shorter outer feathers, creating that graduated wedge-shaped tail. Cuckoo has a similar really wedge-shaped tail, and it leaves it with these tail spots that are really cool to see from underneath. Warblers also have tail spots, a lot of them. And when the tail is closed, it just looks kind of whitish underneath. But when they fly, or you get a picture of the tail spread, you can see that there are spots there on the outer part of the tail feathers. And on juncos, the outer tail feathers are white. And on the closed tail, sometimes you just see an edge or maybe very little. On the underside of the tail, you can see a lot more white. You see how the inner feathers, you can just see a little bit of them there, but it's mostly we're looking at the outer feathers. So important to realize how the tail folds together. One thing we talk about on tails is a terminal band and a subterminal band. So rough-legged hawks have a prominent subterminal band and a narrower but bright pale terminal band, right? So we're talking about before sub, meaning, under, in this case, before the end of. All right, so we've come near the end here now. We've gone through a lot. We've got a little bit more left to do. Can't be bird bombs without some kind of a quiz. And here is a bird that's flying in. Looks like he's coming for a landing, and I can tell he's doing that just by his posture and some other features as well. So let's see, can you find these things? So I'm going to let you look at the bird, and I want you to look for the primaries, secondaries, the primary coverts, and then the three sets of secondary coverts. Okay, so visualize the primaries and their coverts, secondaries and their coverts. All right, there we go. So there's our primaries and secondaries, 1 and 2, primary coverts 3, and number 4, the 3 sets of secondary coverts. So what about supercilium? Don't get supercilious with me, but it's right there above the eye, the line going back, pale often above the eye. And how about the auriculars there, that brown patch? Now, extra credit, tertials should be kind of easy because we've already said primaries, secondaries, and we know tertials are in there somewhere. Notice they're long on this pipet. The alula, where's that? There's our tertials. There's our alula. And the tomia, do you remember? The cutting edge of the bill. All right, so now the bird, I already gave away what it was, I think I said, so I won't worry about that. But I was going to quiz you. But if you didn't hear, the bird has come into land, and we can see some of these details a little more clearly. And we can begin to wonder, so now what's the white line that's coming down from the bill? And I'm talking, it's actually whitish, it's not really white. Here's the lower mandible base, and there's this pale line coming down, and it wraps around below the auriculars. What's the name of that? And then there's a dark line that's bordering below that. Do you know the name of that? Oh, sorry, that's sorry. How about the tertials on this? So we saw them in flight. Can you find it on the closed bird, closed wing? And then we have these two pale wing bars. And do you remember which feather tracks create those pale wing bars? So a lot of songbirds and other kinds of birds, we can see wing bars, and they're often similarly positioned and made by the same two tracks of feathers. And what about the knee on this bird? Where's that? So that a pale line coming down here is the malar line, and there's that lateral throat stripe. Tertials, long tertials, pipits and wagtails have very long tertials in that family. And the two feather tracks are the greater primary coverts and the median primary coverts that often make the two pale wing bars. Sorry, greater secondary coverts, median secondary coverts. And what about the knee? Well, that's where the sun don't shine. So American pipit. And our last quiz image here, we just have two. Hot right now are Bohemian waxwings. Look how beautifully smooth the plumage is on these beautiful birds in this great image by Andy Poland. And these birds have some interesting markings going on. They look very distinctive, but there are 4 distinctive markings on the wings of the upper bird. So let's just focus on that. And can you begin to guess what feather tracks those are on? So this is kind of a little tricky, but it's kind of fun to figure it out. So there's those 4 things I'm talking about. We have these edges that are yellow or white along these feathers. And then there's this white line. And here's another white line, number 3. And number 4 seems to be some red things, which we know if we had a little bit more resolved picture are actually red tips on some feathers. All right, so can you identify those? Here's a bird in flight, and we can kind of put it together a little bit. So number 1, we see these margins, pale margins coming around the tips of these feathers, and that's actually going to be our primaries that have these both colors out along the tips, and the waxwing has fairly long primaries projecting out. Okay, and then number 2 is this prominent white line here is going to be the base of the secondaries. And it's pretty bright. You can see that's pretty bright, but the wing is closed now and the primaries are longer and the outer ones much more so. And so they're kind of graduated and the secondaries are all laying on top of each other over here. And the inner ones, you can see these blurry red spots have these red dots. That's number 4. And those are little adapted tips on the secondaries. Number 3 is this line here. So it's kind of complicated wing pattern on this waxwing on the top. It's a little simpler below, and that leads us to ask another question in a moment. So you know the scapulars, right? Shoulders kind of covering over part of the wing here. And how about the undertail coverts? That's what we're always looking for, is those nice reddish undertail coverts under the tail. But what's different about these 2 waxwings? I pointed out already what it is. It's out here on the primaries. One has yellow and more brightly marked edges coming in along the this edge of the feather. The other just white without those other edges showing. And indeed, this is an adult and a juvenile Bohemian waxwing. All right, so it's kind of cool to see them in flight. You can see those patterns again. And notice in this picture, I just like it because you can see the starling is not a whole lot bigger than the Bohemian, and they have a very similar shape. All right, so what a treat to have those guys around right now. And I want to say thank you to the more than 36 photographers whose images were used in tonight's bird bombs. All the images are credited on each slide. Thank you very much. I'll bet you can appreciate a lot of different markings on this fantastic short-eared owl. And come back and check out past bird bombs on the DFO page. Go to the programs and events and scroll down to find our past programs button, and you can get to any of the past bird bombs and enjoy those, or look for this one in a couple days. It'll be up there. And the idea is you go back and you review and you get more out of it, and you can take it at your own pace. So coming up, first we've got to look at this lovely black-capped chickadee. How many times do you see the alula on a chickadee? It's coming in for a landing on this sunflower head, and you can appreciate all those wing details we were talking about. So the next bird bomb's coming up in 1 month, March 9th, Colorado Blues. But hey, no, we're not talking about the blue jay. No, this is going to be about bluebirds. So bluebird ID coming in 1 month on Bird Bomb. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to have a chance for some Q&A.
Well, thanks, David. If you do have a question, please drop it in the Q&A function in Zoom there, and I'll catch it. First, wow, that was like so much information.
It's a bomb, right?
I feel like I'm going to sleep on it. What, beyond rewatching this and going on field trips with you to like understand these things, how can we practice this? How can we practice, oh, that's that piece and that's that piece, and so I forget the name of that.
So depending on where you're at in your journey here with these sorts of terms and understanding things, I do recommend coming back to look at bird bombs again if you found it helpful so far, and take some time with it to resolve some areas where you have some questions. But a great place to put this into practice and to really start to see things is in the birds that we have close at hand in our backyard, at our feeders and at bird baths, where especially if they're kind of still for a bit, you can even get a spotting scope on them while they're sitting there if you have one, or you often are close enough with your binocs, you can take pictures and you can look for some of these details. You can often see the different feather tracks on the wing. It's a good place to snap pictures of birds landing, and then you can look at those and appreciate the different feathers on the wing, look for different markings because they're right there in front of you. Another really fun group to work with are ducks, because they're also sort of right there in front of you if you go to the right place, and they're kind of big and they have really cool markings. And so you can take a detailed look, and like I say, go to a good duck place and look at each one, try to discern where are the scapulars and where are the tertials. And one thing you're going to see is some really pretty feathers, but you're also going to see that you can begin to put that together. Another great group that is our raptors, when you have something perched on a pole or a wire or flying overhead where you can see them, you can start to say, oh, okay, that is a comma, that is the patagials, that is, a border or whatever. Become cognizant of these things as you're looking.
Awesome, cool. I feel like I'm almost ready for the take-home quiz, the piece of paper that you're going to give me to label the parts. Yes. It actually sounds like a fun exercise now, having watched all this. Like, do I actually know all this? Betsy says, thank you so much. It's generous of you to do these. And then Gail asks, can you give us a hint about distinguishing crows and ravens?
Yeah, I'm going to tell you my secret right here, but I still want you to come out on a field trip, but I told enough people, so it's not very secret. So the difference is you're looking at the bird, and you're looking at the bird and you ask yourself two questions. And sometimes there's more than one, but is it beautiful? And is what it's doing interesting? If the answer to one or both of those questions is yes, it's a raven. Every time, if you're being objective and truthful with yourself, is it beautiful? Is it doing something interesting? Ravens just have it all over crows for how they behave and what they do, I think. And I just think they're really, really fabulous birds. So I know it's really biased, but that's my trick. And it really works. It does. You won't find it in a field guide, but here on Bird Bombs, there you go.
All right, there you have it. Don't pay attention to the tail or size or anything. Yeah. Beautiful and interesting. They're like the celebrities. It really works. Corvids.
Absolutely.
All right, cool. Let's see. Colleen asks, can you say more about borders? BORDERS.
Sure. So mostly when that comes into play, well, it refers to the edge of something, and mostly we're talking about the edge of a wing. And usually with raptors, when you're looking up at the flying bird, and it has a dark trailing edge that may or may not be prominent. And one example is the broad-winged hawk has a nice border there, more so than some others. So that's generally what we're talking about. The border is the edge of a wing, particularly the trailing edge of the wing is how I encounter it mostly. So it's sort of a raptor term, but it could apply generally in other birds as well.
Cool. Let's see. I don't see any more Q&A questions coming in. One last one for you, easy question. If we do want to go out in the field to practice these, are there any great field trips that we should know about coming up?
The cool thing about DFO is we're all about field trips, and we have a great calendar with great leaders. And if you go to dfobirds.org and go to our field trip page, You'll see them all laid out there, and we have calendars showing trips way out into spring right now, and those can become available to sign up at different times. But even right now, there are a lot of trips that are open. I'm leading several that are coming up in the next couple of weeks, and some other leaders have open trips, and others will open up soon. And all those trips are great opportunities to do this, you know, on my trip, because I've done this bird bonds. I'm going to be ready to see cool opportunities to talk about this stuff. So hope to see some of you out there.